Viator and Terra seeks to bring the latest scholarship in medieval times to a general audience. Popular consciousness is rife with misconceptions and myths about medieval times, owing to inertia in the school system, peer education, or just plain laziness. However, our mission needs time and effort to bring about. We're only students not even in medieval studies, but we have great passion towards this interesting and often misunderstood time period. We ask only for the smallest support from our audience. One may find links to our Ko-Fi page and our merchandise store in the description below. In 1173, Henry, the young King of England, rose in rebellion against his father, King Henry II. Before he mustered soldiers, however, the young king's retinue reminded him that he had never been knighted. Henry accepted their advice, and he brought William Marshal, the best knight in all of Europe, to knight him. Yet Marshal had neither land nor anything else, just his chivalry. Here we see powerful men proudly wear the knight's belt together with landless newcomers like William Marshal. Such a sight, however, was unimaginable generations earlier. Knights had begun neither as genteel nor cultured. In Latin, knights were called milites, soldiers. In English, these soldiers were called servants, cnichts. From mere bodyguards and private thugs, knighthood took on a glamorous appeal. At this point we must ask, how did the knights become a group separate from common people? The earliest mentions of milites were from the 9th century. As centralized power waned in the Carolingian Empire, esteemed families focused on their holdings and investments instead of carrying the emperors for favor. Paradoxically, magnates of the realm lost their monopoly on royal prestige, now sharing it with some of these families who had become lesser magnates. Many wrote of how merchants were of consequence from finance, and how farmers were important from agriculture. Knights, however, were known for savagery and wickedness. Knights wanted to live in luxury and lavishness. They would buy elegant dresses and live above their means. To do so, they earned their pay from theft and war. While even farmers bickered and feuded to increase their lands and wealth, knights had only their tenants as proper subordinates. Catholic prelates themselves preached against knights as mere brigands and outlaws, further lowering their social standing. Not all, however, were negative about knights. Stephen de Fougeray, Bishop of Rennes, wrote how knights could protect the church and the laity. He classed them equal to merchants and tradesmen, all answering to dukes and counts. While the merchant needed only to live decently in towns and cities, Stephen wrote that knights had duties to protect the weak and fight wars. Yet even the bishop admitted that knights were a social group in decline. In fact, the Domesday Book records hundreds of milites without land to themselves. By the First Crusade, things had started changing. Chroniclers treated horsemen, equites, and professional soldiers, milites, as one and the same, while footmen, pedites, were a group of their own. Horsemen who lost their horses in the crusade became footmen through hardship. The meaning behind the chronicler's words remained muddy, however. As Joachim Bumke writes, at times it was the military, the social, the religious, the ideological, or the hierarchical meaning of the word which was most prominent. For the most part, they ran parallel to one another, and it is fair to assume that there was mutual influence and that they overlapped. The words milice, chevalier, and ritter thus had different meanings through places and times. However, key passages all point to a social sense developing. Such passage lies in Fulker Charter's Chronicle, where he laments how many nobiles and probi milites died in Ramleh on 17 May 1102. Fulker here means knights and magnates, whom he thought made the noble class. Earlier, in the fall of 1099, Folker notes how milites nobiles became pedites after losing their mounts. Horses were a large investment for soldiers, who needed every advantage to ply their trade. While illustrious by ancestry, these losses caused their status to fall. Finally, when the army of Jerusalem rode in march to face an Egyptian siege, Folker writes that there were 500 of our milites, excepting those who, although riding, were not counted with the name of a soldier. Thus, knighthood had gone from a private thugs on horseback to a prestigious profession by the 12th century. Earlier, in fact, Count Geoffrey II of Perche-Mortain saw no shame in being girded with a knightly belt by 1082. Wihenoc, Breton lord of Monmouth, held the skills of a warrior alongside other knights who rented land from him. These changes ultimately have their roots in changing inheritance laws. The Carolingian Empire continued ancient Germanic practices despite attempted centralization. While differences pervaded, like with female land inheritance between Salian Franks and other tribes, the custom for inheritance was partable. All eligible children had equal shares in property. Some tribes and places, however, did practice the oldest son inheriting all property, Angles, Saxons, and Thuringians being some examples. As the continent moved from custom to codified laws, younger sons also started losing out on inheritance. Wealthy families in England or the continent could see the eldest son taking the lion's share of property. Younger sons who lost out from these changes saw fit to become soldiers and knights. Just as children followed their parents in crafts and trades, so too did sons of these soldiers also become soldiers. Combat doubtlessly forged bonds between these wealthy ones and those who served with them. Soldiery would steadily lose its stigma, so that by 1130, receiving a knight's belt had become equivalent to coming of age among the wealthy in England. Knighthood, while increasingly prestigious, had not yet become the lower boundary for formal nobility by that year. Thus, while esteemed, knights who joined the First Crusade were prestigious from their wealth and skill, not by birth. In German lands and the broader Holy Roman Empire, the class of ministeriales, soldiers who served in households, remained serfs, or in other words, unfree. While unfree, however, they earned enough from their service that they could buy decent estates, and at times even build stone castles. As we had discussed before with feudalism, a serf was just like a modern employee, one beholden to an employer. In one case, the Bishop of Bamberg decreed in his diocese that the son of a ministerial is entitled to his father's fief. If there is no son, the closest arms-bearing relative shall turn over the dead kin's armor and the horse, the best that he had owned, to his lord. The fief of the deceased, however, he may keep for himself. If a ministerial participates in a campaign, he shall join his lord's host at his own expense. After that, he shall be maintained by the lord. This unfreedom made ministeriales attractive to German kings and magnates. Service in their households could stifle any ambition for self-sufficiency and independence, whether by social bonds, by oaths, or even by economic independence. Tensions, however, rose as the ministeriales grew wealthier. One Count Sigard of Berghausen was assassinated by serf soldiers in 1104. In another case, the Ehrenbald family of Bruges had their enemies use the clan's legally unfree status against them. After violently dealing with their enemies, the Ehrenbald family feared that Count Charles the Good of Flanders would also do something similar. The Count was assassinated on Good Friday, 1127, while meditating on the Passion. While servants and servicemen in the empire had servile status in this time, we see that they carried out important military and administrative duties. Their unfreedom also never stopped them from getting prestige, property, and power. These all played into knighthood's emergence. The 12th century and its crisis saw military service further increase in prestige. Wealth and influence were no longer enough to mark one out from common people. Even the simplest that claimed knighthood saw those that stained their hands with soil or lucre to be below them. Knights asserted themselves free, specialized warriors. As one historian noted, the aristocracy of this period were military entrepreneurs. While social and legal ranks remained, soldiery and knighthood transcended these as a satisfying and honorable station. Even those of little land or wealth could take up arms and be seen as a cut above the rest. The mere existence of knightly seals authenticating formal acts points to knights' new sense of their stations. These wax images bore aggressive, armored figures and assertive mottos. Only kings and emperors had used seals. Over time, even mere lords and counts came to use them. Now, knights wanted to make good impressions, literally, through effigies, portraits, and wax seals. In the same vein, the idea of a knight bearing arms and a banner, a knight banneret, went in vogue as barons and richer knights saw themselves a separate breed from lesser soldiers. All these signs and symbols pointed to magnate power, which some knights now dared to claim. A bard wrote a poem summarizing these changes. What is armed combat? Is it the same as working with a sieve or winnow, with an axe or mallet? Not at all. It is much nobler work, for he who undertakes these tasks is able to take a rest when he has worked for a while. What then is chivalry? Such a difficult, tough, and very costly thing to learn, that no coward ventures to take it on. It just happened as society became militarized, and times violent. Armed power and justice had devolved in the jurisdiction of castellans, or castle holders. That time's violence also led to the formation of government, a centralized institution with clear chains of command and responsibility. Western and Central Europe had relied, and still relied, on autonomous politics and local self-regulation for most of its post-Roman history. Consensus had been the ideal, not command, until the crisis' end. Increased societal complication from economic, social, and cultural developments led to bureaucracies forming. Even England, which Henry de Bracton boasted of rights and dues coming from custom approved by usage, saw centralizing bureaucracies form. In fact, no English institution saw more development here than knighthood. Already in 1190, a writer in the court of Richard the Lionheart proposed a radical reform. Let no man henceforth consider that he may make knights in his own land. They should come to the royal court when it is assembled. The king will give to each a sword and a shield, arms and horses, weapons and money, in return for their chief allegiance. This reform would never come to pass, yet it showed how socially sensitive knighthood had become in England. In King Henry I's household, retainer knights who worked as administrators and bureaucrats received 8 pence a day, the going rate for knights on a campaign. Officials with the same functions yet with no knighthood received lower pay. A court official wrote thus in 1170, explaining how the English bureaucracy functions. If the insolvent debtor has ever been knighted, when the other chattels are sold, a horse shall be cut for him, and it must be a made horse, lest the man who is entitled by his rank to ride should be compelled to go on foot. He also adds that knights employed as bureaucrats must be paid more, for they bear horses and armor to do duties when assigned with the treasury. Not all of knightly rank were vigorous warriors, but the official insists that when in trouble for debts, knights must keep their armor and horses exempt from seizure, so that he may fight when needed. King Richard himself passed a regulation for English tournaments in 1200, 4 years after his courtier's proposal. Soldiers who attended tournaments had to pay license fees to participate according to their rank and wealth. Knights had to pay higher fees based on their wealth. By 1220, knights could be removed from court juries simply by having no land and being a household retainer, as one case in Herefordshire shows. Similar ideas became popular in France. Already in the 11th century, French magnates spread their images as mounted, armored soldiers. Their portraits and seals portrayed them with banners and lances. Though these did not consider themselves knights at this time, things would change the next century. The sword would replace the lance in popularity for these depictions, and milites joined dominus in favored titles. King Louis IX also saw new customary laws, with fines for trespassing set the same for barons and knights. In fact, one of King Louis's household sergeant-at-arms risked having his hand cut off at Acre in 1252, for the sergeant had laid its hand on a knight. Another custom that spread in King Louis's time was treating genteel men as likely knights, even if not knighted. The genteel could even counter court cases by requesting a delay for up to a year, and then arranging to be knighted. However, the French had decided to reserve knighthood for the sons of knights, contrary to other parts of Europe. By the mid-13th century, it was no longer true that any knight can make a knight. Truly, knights had become magnates, the highest elite levels in medieval Europe. Knights were especially favored by the king for their power and influence. Needed for their fighting skill, they in turn received privileges from the king. A formal noble hierarchy had begun, as who was noble now fell under the king's domain. Emperors, kings, and princes all became knights alongside less distinguished soldiers. Just as counts, comites, used to be companions of the king, and dukes, duchies, used to be leaders of Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic tribes, so did knighthood become a title of status from its roots in function. Regions expressed these changes differently. The costs and responsibilities of knighthood in England in the 13th century were burdensome enough to persuade many men who could have become knights because of their birth and means to not bother. By 1224, King Henry III and his court felt forced to take the measure of setting up local entries, as to which men they felt were avoiding knighthood and imposing penalties if they continued to resist the honor, which were often avoided by the payment of fines. The king would then send orders compelling knighthood in 1241 and 1242, showing how the royal court was desperate for soldiers. These orders defined a knight as one who owned land worth £20 in annual rent. The definition would shift to £30 in 1253. As knighthood changed, so too would a distinct class of squires appear. In the 11th century, many squires were knights' apprentices and journeymen learning the crafts of war. Others were servants on horseback. Still, others were friends and companions who were the knights' officials, but had no knightly goals. In William Marshall's time, the 1170s, squires had expected little from their masters. By the 1220s, squires could demand both a mount and a pack animal. Squires were now recognizable from their cropped haircuts and short coats bearing their master's heraldry. These would fight with short swords and clubs, wearing quilted leather and iron caps as armor. The poet Henry de Laon noted that in the 11th century, magnates would have come to the field guarded by a score of knights. In the 13th, knights rode out guarded by half a dozen squires, bearing the same arms and heraldry as their master. Squires would also ransom horses, just as knights did. In France specifically, squire would come to refer to some landowners in Vendemois after 1240, with most landowners there claiming the title by the 14th century. It had become a generic noble title for the rest of France, with squires even holding their own festivals and banquets. These would not seek knighting, especially as knighthood had become a royal monopoly. Even in England, Where knighthood was mandatory for those of certain wealth, squires were common in families not rich enough for the title of knight. These changes pointed to another innovation in the knighthood. By the late 13th century, French royal bureaucracy was full of lawyers and administrators who were knighted for their loyal service, even without military service. In Italy, merchants, lawyers, and bankers were regularly given knighthood. This was a relic of when urban militias took the field there before mercenaries became the norm. Indeed, by the 14th century, knighthood meant a host of duties: sitting on juries, helping keep the peace, performing local magistracies, even standing as elected officials of parliament. Some would even act as royal bailiffs, senescals, and investigators for corruption and mismanagement in local governments. New technologies in metallurgy, arms, and armor meant that the standards for military service kept increasing. The most protective armor was manufactured in factories from Milan and Augsburg, whose products carefully fit a man's figure, and these cost a lot for the Middle Ages. Knighthood had become too much of a burden, with the rich and wealthy preferring civilian professions like law and accountancy. Dubbing and knighthood ceremonies also became rarer, with many preferring knighthood later in life. Once again, knighthood was no longer the same as nobility, if only because it had become an exclusive elite within an elite. A reward for loyal service to the king, soldiers on campaign received a new label of men at arms, being mostly squires and mercenaries on top of dubbed knights. Despite these changes, we see that the ethos of what we call chivalry spread beyond knightly ranks. Archers, yeomen, and rich farmers acquired coats of arms, formed brotherhoods that mimicked knightly orders, and read chivalric romances that used to be for the reading elite. Thomas Malory's Death of Arthur was read far and wide by merchants, lawyers, craftsmen, peasants, and yeomen. Even as knighthood closed its ranks, the idea of chivalry would spread far and wide. But what was chivalry? And how did it start? And how did its appeal spread? Et semper rememorator, non omnes vagantes aberarunt.